Welcome to the National Constitution Center, to America's Town Hall, and to our celebration of the 100th anniversary of the certification of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. I am Jeffrey Rosen, the president of this wonderful institution, and we begin our town hall programs by reciting the inspiring mission statement of the National Constitution Center to galvanize ourselves for the learning ahead. So here we go, and friends who have tuned in before can recite along with me. The National Constitution Center is the only institution in America chartered by Congress to increase awareness and understanding of the Constitution among the American people on a nonpartisan basis. Wonderful. It is so meaningful to say those great words with you, and so meaningful to convene with you to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment and the opening of the National Constitution Center's new exhibit, The 19th Amendment, How Women Won the Vote. Friends, I saw the exhibit for the first time on Monday, and it is unbelievably inspiring. And you will meet during our panel the brilliant head of our exhibits department, Elena Popchak, and her amazing team, and the great scholars who created this extremely moving, engaging, and educational account of how women won the vote by telling the stories of the women at the center of the struggle. I want to thank the sponsors of the Women and the Constitution Initiative who made the exhibits possible. They include the Horace W. Goldsmith Foundation, Maury Jane and Mark Perry, the John P. and Ann Welsh McNulty Foundation, the Snyder Foundation, the McLean Contributorship, Glenn Mead, the Stege Communications Group, and Sarah and David Andrews. Thanks to all of you. I hope you've had a chance to tune in today and see our exhibits, tours, and online readings and theatrical experiences for kids. It's been an amazing day of celebration, and we're thrilled to present many of these events in partnership with Vision 2020's Women 100. Now, friends, I have the great pleasure and honor of presenting and introducing a performance of the composer Patrice Michaels' brilliant new work, Resolved, Songs of Women's Suffrage and the 19th Amendment. It features the internationally renowned mezzo-soprano Janae Bridges and the pianist Laura Ward. We're so honored to have been one of the institutions that commissioned Patrice Michaels to set these canonical texts of the 19th Amendment to beautiful music. And she's done that so successfully. And through her beautiful music and through the sublime singing of Janae Bridges and the playing of Laura Ward, you will not only hear but feel the power of these canonical texts, which must be considered part of our founding documents. And I can't wait for you to hear the performance. So you'll hear writings and words from Sojourner Truth, Mary Church Terrell, Ida B. Wells, Susan B. Anthony, and other key leaders of the movement. And then after the performance, we have this remarkable panel of great scholars who will talk about the figures that you've just been introduced to and the text that you've just heard. I'd like to thank so gratefully NBC Universal for producing the performance with dazzling skill. You're just an amazing team that produced this show, and the Academy of Vocal Arts in Philadelphia for providing the venue. And now let's all enjoy and learn from and be moved by the premiere performance by Patrice Michaels of Resolved, Songs of Women's Suffrage and the 19th Amendment.
Hello, I'm Patrice Michaels, composer of the music you're about to hear, Resolved, Songs of Women's Suffrage and the 19th Amendment. Over 170 years ago, a group of visionary Americans convened in Seneca Falls, New York, to reimagine the call of our founding fathers and proclaim their declaration of sentiments. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, That's where our musical journey begins, in 1848 at the first ever Women's Convention. From there, we travel through time with Sojourner Truth, Alice Paul, Mary Church Terrell, and many others, sharing the story of women's suffrage in the words of those who dreamed it, fought for it, and lived it. Our journey culminates with the ratification of the 19th Amendment, the 100th anniversary of which we celebrate today. And now, with heartfelt thanks to the National Constitution Center for hosting this celebration, and to our brilliant performers, internationally renowned mezzo-soprano Janae Bridges and Lyric Fest of Philadelphia pianist Laura Ward, it is my great honor to present Resolved.
A convention to discuss the social, civil, and religious condition and rights of women will be held in the Wesleyan Chapel at Seneca Falls, New York, on Wednesday and Thursday, the 19th and 20th of July. Commencing at 10 o'clock a.m. During the first day, the meeting will be exclusively for women, which are all earnestly invited to attend. Resolved that the women of this nation in 1876 have greater cause for discontent, rebellion, and revolution than the men of 1776. It was we, the people, not we, the white male citizens, but we, the whole people, who formed a union, and we formed it not to give the blessings of liberty, but to secure them, to secure them, not to the half of ourselves and the half of our posterity, but to the whole resolved. The women of this nation resolved. May I say a few words? I want to say a few words about this matter. I am a woman's rights. I am glad to see that men are getting their rights, but I want women to get theirs. And while the water is stirring, I will step into the pool. The poor men seem to be all in confusion and don't know what to do. Why, children, if you have women's rights, give it to her and you will feel better. You have your own rights and they won't be so much better. You have been having our rights for so long that you think like a slave owner, that you own us. I know that it is hard for one who has held the reins for so long to give up. It cuts like a knife. You will feel all the better when it closes up again. I can't read, but I can hear. I have heard the Bible, and I have learned that if caused man to sin, well, if a woman upset the world, to give her a chance to set it right side up again. I am about 80 years old. It is about time for me to be going. I have been 40 years a slave and 40 years free. is time for me to be going. Resolved that this is the duty of women of this country, to secure to themselves their sacred right to the elective franchise. The elective franchise is withheld from one half of its citizens, many of whom are intelligent, cultured, and virtuous, while it is unstintingly bestowed upon the other, some of whom are illiterate, debauched, and vicious, because the word people, by an unparalleled exhibition of lexicographical acrobatics, has been turned and twisted to mean all who were shrewd and wise enough to make themselves born boys instead of girls, or who took the trouble to be born white instead of black.
Mrs. Stone of the National Suffrage Association and the women in charge of the entire parade have advised us to keep our delegation entirely white.
When I was asked to come down here, I was asked to march with the other women of our state, and I intend to do so, or not to take part in the parade at all. If the Illinois women do not take a stand, no, in this great democratic parade, then the colored women are lost. Women should be as firm in standing up for their principles as Southern women are for their prejudices. Take a stand now! Take a stand now! I intend to do so! Mr. President, what will you do for women's suffrage? Mr. President. How long must women wait for liberty? We were put out of jail as we were put in at the whim of the government. They tried to terrorize and suppress us. They could not. So they freed us. Hurrah, and vote for suffrage. Don't keep them in doubt. No doubt, no doubt. I have been watching to see how you stood, how you stood. I noticed some of the speeches against, they were bitter, bitter, bitter. I noticed some of the speeches against, don't forget to be a good boy. Don't forget to be a good boy. Hurrah, hurrah, and vote for suffrage. Don't keep them in doubt, no doubt, no doubt. Hurrah, hurrah, resolved. Resolved, resolved, resolved.
Wow. Bravissima, Janae Bridges, for that extraordinary performance of those galvanizing and inspiring texts, and for giving us Patrice Michael's beautiful music so powerfully. Friends, isn't it remarkable to be able to focus on each word of the texts when they are set to music and performed so beautifully? And by tuning in and recognizing the magnitude of the struggles and the specificity of the claims made by these heroic women, Patrice Michaels, Janae Bridges, and Laura Ward, our amazing pianist, as well as that incredible production team, which you saw at the end from NBC Universal, has inspired us, created a permanent celebration of the 19th Amendment that will live forever at the National Constitution Center and online, and has inspired us tonight. Bravissima to all. And now it is my great pleasure, friends, to introduce our amazing panel to talk about what we've just heard and to help us understand the ideas and the struggles and the biography of the women who we saw highlighted at the end of the video. So I'm now going to introduce our panelists. Marcia Chatland is a Provost Distinguished Associate Professor of History and African American Studies at Georgetown University. She co-hosts Slate's podcast, The Waves, which is a bi-weekly show that covers feminism, gender, and popular culture. She appeared in the PBS special, The Vote, honoring those who fought for women's suffrage in the US, and she's the author of 3 books, including her most recent book, Franchise, The Golden Arches in Black America. Marcia Chatland, welcome, and thanks so much for joining. And Gail Harriet is Professor of Law at the University of San Diego Law School and currently a member of the United States Commission on Civil Rights. She co-wrote the 19th Amendment's explainers for the National Constitution Center's interactive Constitution with Nancy Gertner, who was sorry not to be able to join us tonight. And I want you, friends, to go after the show to the interactive Constitution and read Gail Harriet's brilliant explanation of it, as well as her separate statement about it. And she also served as an advisor to the Constitution Center's new 19th Amendment exhibit. Welcome, Gail Harriet. It's so great to have you.
Jeff.
Wonderful. And my amazing colleague, Elena Popchak, is the exhibition developer at the National Constitution Center. I must once again express appreciation to her for her path-breaking ability to bring to life stories in 3-dimensional forms, and as well as the ideas behind them and to tell a constitutional, legal, and political story in such a galvanizing way is an extraordinary achievement that will adorn the National Constitution Center, I hope, forever. And since she's been with us since 2016, and she also served as the lead developer for our equally inspiring exhibit, Civil War and Reconstruction, the Battle for Freedom and Equality. Elena, thank you, and thank you for joining tonight.
Thanks so much, Jeff. It's great to be here.
Wonderful. Well, let's jump right in to the Great Song Cycle. And the first text that we heard Janae Bridges sing so beautifully was by, I want to make sure that I have the right one because there was that great preamble, of course. And then we began with Susan B. Anthony. And the text that we heard from was her wonderful resolution in 1872, resolved that the women of the nation in 1876 have greater cause for discontent, rebellion, and revolution than the men of 1776, and she ends, no self-respecting woman should wish or work for the success of a party that ignores her sex. That followed the prelude, which of course was from the Seneca Falls Convention itself. Elena, I think I'll just ask you to start because you had to decide where to begin the exhibit and what story to tell. How do you tell the story that begins in some ways, of course, before Seneca Falls, but we have the Seneca Falls Declaration, and then you move to 1876 and to Susan B. Anthony. Tell us how the exhibit deals with that great story.
Sure. So with every exhibit, you have to make a decision of where in time you're going to start. And we had a lot of conversations about it, and we ended up starting in 1848. That is the first formal women's rights convention held in Seneca Falls, New York. But we knew we also had to help visitors understand, well, why were women fighting for the vote at that time? Why were they fighting for other rights, such as, rights to their own property, their children, wages, all of these very important things, and working with, in particular, Gail on this part of the exhibit to make sure people understood the right to vote at that time was limited to certain men by 1848. And that fighting for suffrage was only one demand among many at Seneca Falls. And we hear that and read that in the Declaration of Sentiments, which we do have a rare printing in the exhibit. And I'll fast forward a little bit in time to get to Susan B. Anthony and how we do feature her in the exhibit, particularly when during Reconstruction, she, like many other women, tried to go to the polls and argue that the 14th Amendment granted her citizenship and she should be able to vote. And she was ultimately arrested and fined and charged with illegally voting. And we have a letter that she wrote a couple months after she did that. And she's expressing her surprise and shock at having actually been convicted for that crime. But it certainly was an example for all other women who were trying that tactic.
Thank you so much for that. Marcia Chatland, there's so much to say, of course, about the evolution from Seneca Falls to 1876, but what would you like to highlight about Susan B. Anthony?
Well, I think that Susan B. Anthony and all the women who are featured in this cycle represent something that I often explain to my students about the deep animating energy of this movement. These women were incredibly intellectually engaged, thoughtful people who had spent years in both formal and informal study, and to understand your capacities in a society and then know that they are cut off by these legal mechanisms is something that is incredibly poignant and sustains a lot of movements. And I think that the other part of understanding the origins of this iteration of women's rights struggle is to understand that women in a number of capacities were already being citizens, and they didn't have the formal right to vote. And I think that this is a really important thing for us to note, that while voting is an incredibly powerful act, For the majority of our nation's history, when people were excluded from the ballot, they still were being good citizens by creating community resources, by supporting each other. And so I think that for a lot of these women, while they're listening to these often sexist debates about their capacity, they knew what they were able to do, and they were able to use those collective energies in order to make a case for women's suffrage.
Thank you so much for that. Gail, Harriet, in your definitive explainer on the interactive Constitution, you note that women were indeed voting in the colonial era. In New Jersey, they had the right to vote until 1807, and then it was rescinded. What would you like our friends to know about that important transition point that maybe begins with the Declaration at Seneca Falls and then takes us up to Susan B. Anthony in 1876?
You mean you don't want me to talk about New Jersey? New Jersey.
No, please do. Please do. Tell us about New
There were
Jersey.
actually women voting in New Jersey, starting with their 1776 Constitution, which might have been a mistake. I don't know whether they really intended that, but they said all inhabitants who otherwise, have the property qualification and all could vote. And then in the 1790s, they made it clear that yes, they meant women. But then in the very early 19th century, there were all sorts of voter fraud allegations, including allegations that some men had voted once, come back dressed as women and voted a second time, and they very quietly got rid of the women's vote. The thing I wanted to, and alas, I don't know if anybody objected as loudly as they should have. There's not recorded in history. But looking then ahead to Susan B. Anthony, she is, I think, quite rightly a little bit, she's discouraged at the time that she's writing that little piece. But in some sense, maybe she shouldn't have been, because the revolution was already taking place over in Wyoming. A couple of years before Anthony wrote the piece that we just heard, which was fabulous, by the way. The Wyoming territory, and Wyoming was just a territory at the time, had included votes for women in that territorial constitution. And when they applied to be a state, Congress initially balked. They didn't want Wyoming to be a state if women could vote. So it was communicated back to the Wyoming legislature that, yeah, you got to get rid of this thing about women voting. That could give women in the rest of the country some ideas we don't want to give them. And to their everlasting credit, the Wyoming legislature wired back to Washington, we will stay out of the Union 100 years before we come in without the women. Which I've always liked that story. And so there's my little contribution for cheering Susan B. Anthony up at that point in time.
Well, thank you for that. And yes, indeed, the performance was fabulous. And thank you, friends who are watching. There's lots of great comments in the comment box. Wow, what a wonderful production. Love the music and the episode of Without It Be Wells. All congratulating Janae Bridges and Patrice Michaels for their amazing job. And friends, please chat questions in the Q&A box. And if we have time after talking about the figures who we just heard about, would love to pose them to our panelists. Elena, the exhibit does such a spectacular job at basically telling the story of the forces that changed public opinion, male public opinion about women's suffrage. But one of the central stories that you talk about is, of course, race. And our second piece, Patrice's second piece, is from Sojourner Truth. That piece was dedicated to Janae Bridges, and it's from her address to the Women's Rights Convention in 1851. May I say a few words? I want to say a few words about this matter. I am a woman's right. I am above 80 years old. It is about time for me to be going. I have been here 40 years a slave and 40 years free, and would be here 40 years more to have equal rights for all. Elena, how does the exhibit deal with the important question of race and the right to vote, and of course that about Sojourner Truth and her central role in the fight for women's suffrage?
Well, working on the exhibit and reading and learning about Sojourner Truth, I think her story in particular captures early on, 1850s, how white women actually were manipulating her voice and her words in order to, in their minds, project an idea of what a formerly enslaved woman should sound like. And they often would rewrite her speeches in order to present that type of figure and that stereotype. And it becomes very challenging for an historian to parse that out and figure out what are the true sources. When we traditionally hear that speech where she's saying, "Ain't I a woman?" that did not happen. And that was an instance where her words were butchered to sound like that. So she's one of the earliest figures that we see how that manipulation is happening and how white women are trying to control the narrative and ultimately exclude certain Black women from the movement that didn't kind of fit that type.
Thank you very much for that. And you convey that so powerfully in the exhibit. I'm in the comments box, a bunch of great questions. Please credit the fantastic pianist. Yes, indeed, Kristen Roach. I mentioned Laura Ward at the beginning, but I must thank her again. She was so beautiful, and I loved her intervention of reading the objection from white women, which Janae Bridges responded to. That was an incredibly moving touch. Is the exhibit virtual as well as physical, asks Adele Nicholson. We've put some of it online. Elena's given some great exhibit tours, and you can go to the exhibit page. Oh, and friends, here's the most amazing thing. There are 3 incredible online interactives, which are all online on the Interactive Constitution. So you can trace early drafts of the 19th Amendment and see that in as early as 1868, one draft would have guaranteed universal suffrage for all African-American men and women alike. But that was narrowed. There's another interactive that shows the state-by-state debate about the right to vote, which is riveting. And then there's one where you can actually hear the debates, which Elena and her team brought to life. So all of that is online. Go learn from it as soon as this show is over, because it's so great to share this with the world. And that's, Elena, that was another just phenomenal job you guys did in putting that together. Marcia Chatland, you've written powerfully about Sojourner Truth, as well as the fissure between African-American and white women during the fight for women's suffrage. Tell us about Sojourner Truth and the broader movements that she represented.
Yes, Elena's point is well taken, and I have an illustrative example that I use with my students at Georgetown. If you go to the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., they have a series of needlepoint cushions, prayer cushions, that are supposed to represent American history. And the one that represents Sojourner Truth has the representation of cotton. And I took a picture of it and I showed it to my students and I said, at the end of the semester, you should be able to spot why this representation is wrong. And I think that when we think about African-American women in slavery, so much of the dominant frame has been Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman. And so my students are often surprised, and a lot of people are surprised, to realize that she was enslaved in New York, that she did not run away from slavery, that in fact she was part of the amelioration and gradual emancipation strategy of the state of New York, that she spoke Dutch, that her experience of enslavement was on a dairy farm. And I think that this is so critically important to understand Sojourner Truth in relationship to not only the question of race as it informed the political decisions of the suffrage movement, but to also understand the political uses of history as a symbol. And Sojourner Truth as a figure emerges in the 19th century and reemerges in various contexts throughout the civil rights movement. Women like Rosa Parks, who were activists around issues of voting, as well as investigating sexual violence against Black women in the South. They named their clubs after Sojourner Truth. And again, we see white women in feminist movements in the 60s and 70s take her icon as a way of thinking about women's rights broadly. And so she is an incredible figure, not only in this question of suffrage and the question of slavery, but in religious thought, her own times as a spiritual wanderer. And so all of this is to say that at this moment, we have this incredible opportunity to go back and rethink the historical figures we've we've been presented with. And everyone should do themselves a favor and read Nell Painter's book about Sojourner Truth, which is such a beautifully and richly done text, because it not only tells her story, but it talks about the ways that we have to be so careful not to manipulate historical figures for our own purposes.
Thank you for that. Thanks for the great book recommendation of Nell Painter's book. We'll try to put it in the chat for our friends. And the more reading recommendations, the better from all of our panelists. We must read and learn about this crucial period. Gail Heriot, so much to say about Sojourner Truth and her legacy, including the fact that she was an advocate for abolition, temperance, and civil and women's rights. Tell us what we should know about the relation between those movements, as well as the fissures within the women's suffrage movement.
Well, what I can tell you, it's just very hard to know everything that Sojourner Truth was saying. She was a gifted orator at a time when orators were extremely important. But as we were saying, every text of this speech actually is different. And for example, she says, "I am above 80 years old." She actually wasn't above 80 years old at the time of that speech. That is some error of one of the transcriptions. And so I don't want to comment too carefully here on how she would have made the argument, because we don't have an authoritative text here. What we have is the knowledge that she was considered gifted as an orator, though at times she felt shy about her oratory skills. I've heard a story where instead of giving a speech, she once sang a song because she thought that would be more effective, and which is kind of an adorable story, don't you think? But yeah, like many people during that era, she was involved not just with one of the great issues, but more than one. And women's rights, sure, but emancipation was also important. She's writing here, speaking here in 1851. So emancipation was the more pressing issue at the time for her and for most Americans.
What a fascinating fact to learn about the transcription era. It teaches us both to pay close attention to and also to examine historical context of the text. Lucinda B asks, where can we all get the lyrics to Resolved? I will check with Patrice, and I hope, if she agrees, that we can post them online, because they're a crucial part of her amazing contribution. And thank you, Michelle Zaga, for incredible performance for all. What an amazing, important composition by Patrice Michaels. Our next text is the recitative Duty to Themselves, and indeed it's from the Declaration of Sentiments itself, resolved that this is the duty of women of this country to secure to themselves their sacred right to the elective franchise. That word about secure, of course, so central to the preamble to the US Constitution, and here the women of the country declare themselves to be created equal along with the men, invoking Jefferson's Declaration. Elena, we jumped right in, and Patrice isn't entirely chronological in her selection of texts, but what do we need to stress now about both the Declaration of Sentiments, and in particular, tell us what you think is important about Elizabeth Cady Stanton, as I've learned to pronounce her middle name, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Lucretia Mott.
So with the Declaration of Sentiments, and like many other things in the suffrage movement, they're looking to the Declaration of Independence, and they're looking for a rewriting of it to declare that all men and women are created equal. And we, in addition to featuring a rare printing in the exhibit, next to it, we've pulled out all of the 16 grievances that they announce against men. And because it was modeled after the Declaration of Independence, instead of listing those grievances against the king, they changed that and list how he's keeping her from access to education, and all these things that we take for granted today. And it's hard to put ourselves in that place at that time. And I think the most important thing about Elizabeth Cady Stanton, since she is such a symbol of the movement and lives for a very long portion of this period, does not live to see the amendment, but the early 1900s passes away. But she's fighting for much of her life for all of these demands, including the right to vote. But she was born into an elite slaveholding family. And then she herself becomes an abolitionist, but getting back to the racism in the movement, by the time we get to the 14th and 15th Amendments, that's where her arguments are becoming extremely racist. And she's wanting to just pursue votes for white women, and particularly educated, privileged white women. So she's a complex figure, and we often simplify her. So it's just important to note all of those elements of her life.
Thank you for that. Marcia Chatland, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, of course, had some real fissures with African-American women, and her legacy in this regard is not always an easy one to examine. Tell us about Elizabeth Cady Stanton and also Lucretia Mott.
Well, I think that what they represent really well, again, when we talk about complexity and layers, is that the fight against slavery and the abolition movement wasn't necessarily a movement for racial social equality. Those are two different things. And so the fact that a lot of these women became politically active in anti-slavery movements meant that they were against the institution of slavery. But if you look at the various tracks, and I'm sure the Constitution Center has a lot of these, of people in the abolition movement, they all had very different visions of what the end of slavery is supposed to look like. And again, these are some of the most exciting opportunities I have with my students. Should emancipation be gradual? Should there be repatriation to a colonized Africa? When we talk about the end of slavery, do we mean voting rights for everyone? Do we see abolitionists support interracial marriage? Very few did. I mean, this was a radical idea. You know, do we think about agrarian utopian society as the next step? And so when you look at what it means for people to abhor an institution, but have such different visions on what happens on the other side, I think it helps you better understand the racism that was able to flourish and become an important political lever in the suffrage movement. Because the idea of one person, one vote seems very simple to us by a 21st century lens, but the idea of the capability and the capacity for a person to be a citizen in the world was very different, even among movements where we often associate them with a kind of progressive spirit or idealism. And I think the last thing I will say is that intellectually, I don't think that these women were outliers in their time. They were very much informed by racial science. Books like The Race Traits of the Negro come out in 1896, and smart people are believing in these types of ideas that will fuel eugenics into the 20th century. And so I think that the question of race in the suffrage movement is a cautionary tale about the deep desire, again, to use historical figures for our own personal needs, rather than to understand the complexities and the choices of people in the past who were still able to be very influential in their time.
Thank you so much for that. We have a question about whether this great discussion, as well as the amazing performance, will be available online so we can share it with others. Yes, Patricia Scott, we will definitely post all of this on YouTube immediately, share it, and so all can learn from it. Gail Harriet, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott had different views about race. Elizabeth Cady Stanton made statements that would be considered racist today. Lucretia Mott was both an early feminist activist and a strong advocate for ending slavery. She and her husband were ardent abolitionists and a part of the Garrison's American Anti-Slavery Society in the 1830s. So there was a range of views, of course, among white women. Tell us about Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and the difference in their views.
Well, that wasn't the only thing that they disagreed on. Of course, Lucretia Mott was a Quaker, and Quakers had always led the abolition movement. And, you know, Elizabeth Cady Stanton's background was very different. But what I find interesting is they also disagreed on whether or not to go forward with the voting rights issue for women. Stanton records in her writings that when she first brought up the possibility of making the resolution at Seneca Falls that women should go out and secure for themselves the right to vote, Lucretia Mott's response was, "Lizzie, you will make us look ridiculous." And Stanton says, "I persisted, for I saw that the right to vote," I can't remember exactly the quote, is what actually backs up all the substantive rights that she cared about as well. And people think when they hear about the Seneca Falls Conference that it was all about women's right to vote, but that really was very much a sidelight. The issue that was probably addressed most was the right of married women, what they would have called in those days civil rights, which to them would have meant the right to own property, the right to be able to buy and sell, the right to be able to sue in a court of law, and most importantly, to be sued in a court of law. Married women did not have those rights. Single and widowed divorced women would have those rights, but not married women. And I've got students who will say, the right to be sued, what kind of a right is that? That sounds horrible. I want to not be able to be sued. But think again, if you cannot be sued, you cannot borrow money, because nobody is going to be quite stupid enough to give a bundle of money to somebody who cannot be held in a court of law and required to pay it back. If you can't borrow money, very difficult to own a farm. Farmers usually have to borrow, get seed, they've got to have money to tide them over before the harvest comes in. It's almost impossible to run a business. And yet in the frontier society that we were dealing with at the time, married women were very routinely deserted, and men would go and never be seen again. And so a lot of them were left in a situation where they didn't really have title to the property that they were living in. Very difficult. And that was more important to the people at the Seneca Falls conference. That was the issue that they were battling. They'd already won it in several states. I know Mississippi was one of them, had passed a law allowing married women to own property and to be sued. New York had just passed theirs, I believe. And so the idea of voting rights, that was quite radical at the time. It didn't get as many positive votes at the conference as the other issues did.
Thank you very much, Gail Harriet, for helping us understand this crucial distinction between civil and political rights that was so important in the 19th century. Elena, in the Civil War exhibit, you and your team tell the story so well about how the ratifiers of the 14th Amendment believed that it covered only civil and not political rights. In other words, it did not extend the right of suffrage to African-American men, and indeed inserted the word male into the Constitution for the first time in Section 2 of the 14th Amendment, anticipating that Southern states might deny the right to vote to African-American men, even as they were prohibited from denying civil rights, like the right to sue and be sued and to make and enforce contracts, from all citizens. And yet, as Gail Harriet suggests, married women continue to be denied civil rights, to which the 14th Amendment seemed to guarantee to all. And that process continued even after the passage of the 14th Amendment. Our next text is from Mary Church Terrell. It's from the National Women's Suffrage Association Convention of 1900. The elective franchise is withheld from 1/2 of its citizens, many of whom are intelligent, cultured, and virtuous, while it is unstintingly bestowed upon the other, some of whom are illiterate, debauched, and vicious, because the word people, I have to read the whole thing because it's such an amazing text, by an unparalleled exhibition of lexicographical acrobatics has been turned and twisted to mean all who are shrewd and wise enough to have themselves been born boys instead of girls, or who took the trouble to be born white instead of black. Wow. Well, Elena, the question really is, and Henry Stoller poses this in the Q&A box, after Reconstruction, the 14th Amendment seems to guarantee civil rights to all. And he asked, with the beginning of Jim Crow disenfranchisement of African Americans, were there any coordination between advocates of women's suffrage and African Americans? Because each group was essentially seeking the same result. And that's a long way of saying, what was Mary Church, what was the background behind which she was arguing in 1900?
I would love to punt some of those questions to our scholars on the panel here, but I can talk briefly about how in the exhibit we feature the multiple generations, because now we're getting into what I would consider as the third generation of suffragists, and Mary Church Terrell is part of that. But and that just helps us understand how long it took for women to get the right to vote. And it didn't end in 1920, as I'm sure we'll get to. But Terrell is clearly a professional lecturer from that incredible text that you just read. But while she's that third generation, and her story continues with organizing with the National Association of Colored Women, forming in 1896 and continuing into the early 1900s, she was born enslaved. So it's hard to fathom, but she's born during the Civil War, and she's born enslaved in Tennessee. And ultimately, thank goodness for her circumstances, her family is able to assume great wealth after the Civil War, and she's able to get an education. And also the color of her skin was it was light, and allowed her to participate in both Black and white suffrage organizations, which there was so much racism and exclusion at this point in the 1890s and beyond, that she's one of those few women that I was coming across that could actually pass between two worlds.
Thank you very much for that. Well, Marcia Chatland, Elena has passed the baton to you to tell us even more. And she told us a lot about Mary Church Terrell, 1900, and both the fissures and alliances among African-American women in the movement at that point.
She's such a fascinating character because she is among a very small elite. She attends Oberlin College. She's very politically connected and very central in Washington, D.C.'s high society. And I think for her, that statement, that argument about refinement is a strategy that will be used by members of organizations like the Black women's clubs and then later the Black women's sororities, in which you make the argument for your fitness for the right to vote based on achievement, appearance, and refinement. And this is something that, when we speak about our next figure, their relationship is actually quite interesting because you start again to see a movement of Black women that are committed to the idea of Black suffrage, of Black civil rights, but their ability to, conform's the wrong word, but their willingness to accept some of the discriminatory behaviors of the white women's clubs are very different. And as a woman who sometimes passed as white in order to travel in a certain kind of style, as a woman who after the 1920s, she actually gets involved in a number of lawsuits, and they're about integrating organizations like the American Association of University Women. And so her activism is really about Black women of a certain class and of a certain position being recognized for who and what they are. And I'm being a little unfair, but that's kind of the key that she sang in throughout her time as an activist. And it was incredibly polarizing. This did not always work, but I think that the centrality of her message is that the mark of race obscures the ability for recognition of the levels of education, achievement, refinement, and again, participatory citizenship that Black women had been exercising in a number of ways.
That's amazing, and that really does help us understand the disdain that she has for these men, these white men who are not educated, and understanding how important it was for recognition of who she was, as you put it so well. Gail, Harriet, so much to say about Mary Church Terrell. Questions from our audience about the intersectionality of suffrage prohibition and the income tax movement, but I'll let you take up any aspect of our story that you think best.
not sure I'm gonna get the income tax movement point, but maybe I'll get it in a minute. But you know, I agree with Marcia about a lot of this. I mean, she knows a good deal more about Mary Church Terrell than I do, but you're getting the same thing in other issues. I mean, down in Louisiana with Plessy versus Ferguson, it was very important that in that case about segregation on railroads as mandated by the state of Louisiana. A case that made it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided that segregation of this sort was just fine. Homer Plessy was an African-American, but he actually was very, very, very light-skinned to the point where, again, he was in a position to pass, and that some people of that era you know, were identifying not with African-Americans as a whole, but rather with those who are light-skinned and can pass. And the argument was made that Homer Plessy was practically white and therefore should be able to ride with the whites on the train. The argument was not made in the way that we sort of think of it today, that there just should not be segregation at all. It was a more complex argument. The attorney representing Homer Plessy very much wanted, and this was one of those lawsuits that was put together by concerned citizens who wanted to present a case to as high a court as possible that Louisiana's law was unconstitutional, but they very definitely wanted a plaintiff who was very light-skinned.
Thank you for that. We have our next aria, which is The March, and it is 1913. And Elena, gosh, you do such an incredible job. I have in my mind the picture of those burning logs of liberty from Philadelphia that were brought in front of the White House in 1913 to try to change President Wilson's mind. And Patrice's text is from Ida B. Wells. That's when Laura Ward, the pianist, calls out loudly, Mrs. Stone of the National Suffrage Association and the women in charge of the entire parade has advised us to keep our delegation entirely white. And Janae Bridges responded, when I came down here, I was asked to march with the other women of our state, and I intend to do so or not to take place in the parade at all. Tell us how you tell the story so well in the exhibit of Ida B. Wells and the parade of 1913.
So very similarly to the text featured here, we include a letter from a Howard University sorority asking Alice Paul, the parade organizer, that whether they can be assigned to a desirable spot in the parade. And they write her multiple times, they don't hear back. And by the time they arrive, they hear, just like Ida B. Wells, they need to march in the back. And multiple women defied that order, as Ida B. Wells does, and marches with her Chicago delegation. And I love when you're able to come across photographs that exist. There's the Chicago Defender has the image of her proudly marching in the Cook County delegation. And we also include a quote from the NAACP's Crisis magazine saying that the women of color marching in the parade made such a admirable addition and showing at the parade. They were so proud. So despite being told to march in the back and be beaten down, in that particular situation, it's great to have those moments of those beautiful stories that change the narrative a bit.
Thank you for that. Marcia Chatland, who was Ida B. Wells?
Oh boy, I could do this all night, but I'll try to be brief. Ida B. Wells is a figure that I appreciate her inclusion in the story because she was incredibly prolific as a writer, so we get to know what she was thinking at all times. She also left her diary for us of her time in Memphis, but I have yet to come across another historical figure who was so clear in her disdain, when she had a disdain for someone, that there was never a question how she felt. In my first book, I write about her work in terms of child welfare and child protection. And she has, entire passages in her autobiography where she explains all of the reasons why she was upset with someone and every reason why they were wrong. And she just was unabashed. And this was a woman who had essentially been run out of the South because of her stance against lynching. She's actually emblematic of the various movements that led women into full suffrage participation. She was in the anti-lynching movement, she was in the temperance movement, and she had a huge falling out with Frances Willard over the issue of lynching. She was engaged in fights to raise the minimum age of consent for sexual activity as a means of protecting African-American girls and young women who were laboring as domestics. She started the Alpha Suffrage Club, and she was really integral in the election of one of the first Black aldermen in Chicago. And the last thing I will say about her work is that I think what is important to look at is after the passage of the amendment, what ways these women were able to continue to think about electoral politics, either by running for office, even if it was symbolic, and by registering voters and ensuring that they could create voting blocks within their communities. And, what a worthy figure for celebration during this anniversary.
Thank you for that, Gail Harriet. Ida B. Wells, and also the broader significance of that 1913 march in front of the White House and how President Wilson changed his mind.
Well, first I want to comment on Wells here. I mean, you can certainly understand her rage at being told that women of color were supposed to be marching in the back, if at all. And for me, at least, since I've lived in Chicago a lot, it's particularly galling that it is Illinois, the land of Lincoln, the first state to ratify the 13th Amendment prohibiting slavery. But we owe it to ourselves to actually look at it from the other side as well, and what is going on in the minds of the group that is telling her that she can't march with everyone else. And I'm trying to figure that out. And what I'm thinking is, back in Seneca Falls, women's rights issues were considered to be less important. And, frankly, I can understand why people were saying, let's concentrate on abolition first. And we'll get to, we'll put more energies into women's rights a little bit later. And then the Civil War occurs. We get the Reconstruction amendments. Women are saying, wait, as long as you're as long as you're going to do the 15th Amendment that will prohibit discrimination based on race, let's include sex too. And they were told, wait, we have to put race first. And I can understand that because I think it actually was more important at the time. And then later we get disfranchisement, massive disfranchisement in the South. And they're pitching for a constitutional amendment. And they know that they are going to have to get that amendment not only passed through Congress, but they're going to have to get 3/4 of the states to ratify it. Down in the South, there was a lot of talk of, is this going to be basically a package deal with greater enforcement of the 15th Amendment? Is this going to turn around our disfranchisement? And you can see why people that were looking for women's suffrage were nervous about the issue. That doesn't justify what they did, but it's important that we understand where they are coming from.
Thank you very much for that. It's getting dark as the sun goes down here outside the virtual Constitution Center, and the AV team has asked me to reach for my iPhone, which I'm going to do, and see if we can cast a little light. Not at all the most important thing, but Elena, the exhibit is so well lit that I know you'll appreciate the effort. I don't know if that helps at all. Elena, our next 3 pieces are from Alice Paul is the main speaker. And we have Torture, which is without words in honor of women who were jailed and tortured for their beliefs. We have Alice Paul's They Could Not. We are put out of jail at the whim of a government. They tried to terrorize and suppress us. They could not, so they freed us. And we also have Alice Paul in 1913, Mr. President, what will you do for women's suffrage? Do you not understand the administration has no right to legislate for currency, tariff, and other reform without first getting the consent of women? I thought it was so amazing in the exhibit, Elena, how you have a jail cell, which is actually has the recording of a suffrage advocate who was imprisoned and gave a firsthand account. She was a Jewish Eastern European immigrant. Tell us about that part of the exhibit, because it's just so amazing. And then tell us about Alice Paul and her role in these protests.
Well, doing research for the exhibit, I'm always looking for either primary source text or artifacts that can somehow be included. And one of the items I came across was a grouping of oral history interviews that were conducted in the 1970s with suffragists who, it seems amazing, but were alive by the 1970s. And we're talking about their experiences. And one of those women that you described was Ernestine Hera Ketler. And she's coming from New York. She travels to Washington, D.C. She's only 21. She was the absolute youngest that they would go to allow the picketing of the White House, because they knew they would ultimately get arrested and end up in jail. And that was part of the tactic, because it would change public sentiments in favor of women's suffrage. So we recreated her experience that she describes. We had an actress re-record the audio and pull that all together in a very compelling piece that includes reenacted silhouettes of what she's describing. So you actually enter this jail cell to very intimately experience this right along with her as she's remembering this. And it's incredibly powerful and compelling. And we have Alice Paul, among others, to thank for these types of tactics by the time we get to 1917, when the first picketing begins, because she saw these tactics being used in the British suffrage movement. So she brings them to America when she returns and invigorates the movement. And that's really those final few years of the movement that we typically think of, and we think of the great photography and footage that exists from that time of women taking their cause more publicly out there and using more militant tactics.
Thank you for that. Thanks for teaching us that Alice Paul's trip to England, where she met the American Lucy Burns, helped her learn more militant protest tactics. Marcia Chatland, there's so much to say about Alice Paul. She was the author of the Equal Rights Amendment in 1923. What should we know about her and her activities between 1913 and her authorship of the amendment in 1923?
Well, I think that Alice Paul's leadership shows the really radical spirit of the idea animated in the protest. And I think that one of the issues that I think this commemoration has done really well with is understanding that women's suffrage was about a series of battles, some ideological, some social, and some political. And I think the confrontation on the streets, the testimony about torture, the lack of fear of direct action, and understanding these activities as moving the movement closer to its goals rather than a distraction is something that I think is really profound for the period, because it's such a politically risky move. And the last thing I would say is that, we have to think of this in terms of a global movement. Even though this was about women in the US getting the right to vote, the fact that they were so informed by like you said, Lucy Burns and the Parkhurst Army and all of these other different tactics that they saw overseas shows us the type of mobility that some of these women had, and the importance of understanding women's suffrage within a global context by the time it becomes an issue for Woodrow Wilson.
Thank you for that. Gail Harriet, Alice Paul, and whatever we should know also perhaps about the introduction of the Equal Rights Amendment, which she wrote in 1923. What was she trying to achieve that she thought that the 19th Amendment had not?
Well, the 19th Amendment covers voting rights, period. And she wanted a constitutional amendment that would guarantee equal rights between men and women on all things. And it really didn't go anywhere immediately. And maybe, I think back over history, what would happen if this had been just a little bit different? What if she hadn't drafted the Equal Rights Amendment when she did? Because the language that she used didn't change much over the course of the next few decades. And if you look at the 1964 Civil Rights Act, it's worded somewhat differently with regard to employment. It bans sex discrimination, but it has a little section on what they call bona fide occupational qualifications. So it allows for a few things like separate bathrooms at a place of employment. That would have been a no-brainer under the 64 Act. If you look back at Alice Paul's language, it would have presumably outlawed things like drafting men but not women. And it is only in fairly recent times that that would have been a politically plausible position to take. And so the language of it really wasn't likely to get off the ground. And maybe had it been drafted a little bit later, it might have done better than it did in the 1970s and very early 80s. I've just wondered sometimes whether someone drafting the same kind of amendment in the year, say, 1965, might have written something that would have actually gotten through both Congress and the 3/4 of states that was necessary. So she was ahead of her time, and she was fighting against statutes that were really quite common in the progressive era, that were protective legislation. Legislation, for example, that only allowed women to vote to work a certain number of hours, made them less competitive than men in many cases. And so she's into this equality kind of feminism, when others were into what we would later call a difference feminism, where it was expected that laws might be different as they applied to men and women because men and women are different, or so it is thought.
Thank you for that. Well, we have one more text, so this is the equivalent of closing statements, but it's an important one to close on, and that's the letter from Phoebe Byrne to her son, who was a Tennessee legislator and cast the deciding vote that brought the 19th Amendment over the edge. And the text is, we have a reproduction of it in the exhibit, and I think we may be getting the real one. Elena will tell us, but it says, "Hurrah and vote for suffrage, don't keep them in doubt. I noticed some of the speeches against. They were bitter. I have been watching to see how you stood, but have not noticed anything yet. Don't forget to be a good boy, your mother." Elena, this is a much discussed letter. What do we make of it in the exhibit, and what should our viewers know about how the exhibit closes?
So we will unfortunately not be getting the letter, but that's only because we took over an entire case with Pennsylvania's ratification copy, and we hope over the course of the next few years, while this exhibit is open, it is long-term, that we'll be cycling in different states' ratification copies. So that's our premier artifact at the end of the show. But I know the story is just so wonderful, how we ultimately get to ratification, but I'll just set the scene and let someone else tell the story, that as they're arriving in the Tennessee legislature to cast their votes, certain men are wearing a yellow rose, indicating that they're going to vote yes for suffrage, and that's a color that's used by the suffragists for much of the movement all the way from 1867 with the Kansas campaign. That's Kansas's state flower is the sunflower, so that color continues. And the anti-suffragist will come in with a red rose, and Harry Byrne comes in with that red rose. So the story does take a turn. And I'll pass that along to someone else to complete the story. But I do want to end with how 1920 is not the final moment. And we alluded to it earlier, but there are millions of women of color who are not able to vote, and also poor women who are subjected to poll taxes and literacy tests. So on this day, as we celebrate the 100th anniversary of the amendment certification, let's not forget that that fight needed to continue through 1965 with the Voting Rights Act.
Thank you for that. Thank you for finishing the exhibit in such an inspiring way. And one of the last things that visitors see at the end of the amazing exhibit that you and your team created is a quotation from Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg from U.S. versus Virginia. And this is a good time for me to share the wonderful news, which we just released today, that on September 17th, Justice Ginsburg will receive the National Constitution Center's 2020 Liberty Medal. We're so excited that she's agreed to accept it, and we're going to honor her with a virtual tribute in words and music, including some of her favorite opera singers and special friends, to create an evening that will be especially meaningful for her. The video is produced by the same amazing team from NBC that just gave us Patrice's incredible video, so you'll have a sense of just how galvanizing and moving those performances are going to be. They're among the greatest opera singers in the world, like Janae Bridges, and I can't wait to share it with you. So everyone tune in on September 17th, Constitution Day at 6:30, live on the National Constitution Center website for the 2020 Liberty Medal awarded to Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Marcia Chatland, it's up to you and Gail to close off this superb, rich, illuminating discussion by telling the story of Representative Byrne's change of vote. What was the significance of that letter, and more broadly, how close was it up to the final stretches of the 19th Amendment? How did it get over the edge?
I'm going to punt to Professor Harriet on this one, because I know the kind of standard narrative. I don't know if there's a secret story underneath.
Oh, I don't know if there's a secret story, but it's a great story. Phoebe Byrne, known as Miss Feb, was a very formidable woman. She was college educated. She ran a large farm. And she wrote, as Elena said, to her son, who was the youngest member of the Tennessee Assembly at the time. It was a hot August day. Everybody's fanning themselves. They think that this is exciting. We don't know what's going to happen, but they did believe that Harry Byrne was going to vote no. I mean, he had the right symbol on, but he gets this letter. And they're going through the role of the legislators, and pretty much everybody knows how each legislator is going to vote. But Harry Byrne, unexpectedly, votes yes. And they've got these lists. They know, he's supposed to be a no, and they know if they get an extra vote, they're going to win. And so at first, people thought, wait, did I hear that correctly? Did he say yes? Didn't he mean no? And then when they realized he's a yes, pandemonium breaks out in the Tennessee legislative room there. Harry Byrne himself runs for it. He goes and hides up, I believe, in like a room that they refer to, I believe, as the attic somewhere, because, well, we don't know why he did it, but we can speculate that he thought that those who were counting on a no vote were going to be none too pleased. But it's almost a biblical story. I mean, here, Tennessee was one of the very last states that was a possibility for ratifying the 19th Amendment. A number of states had already rejected it. Really, there wasn't much choice. This was their last chance. And the love of a son for his mother determines the rest of history. And it just seems only right that that should be so. And so I am a big Phoebe Byrne fan. Hooray for Phoebe, Miss Feb.
Wow, thank you for telling that story so movingly and so well. Marcia Chatland, you graciously let Gail tell the story, and I'm glad you did. You should have the last word in this amazing discussion. I mean, and Gail has reminded us that it was close. It was close. It might have gone the other way. What would you like our friends to leave thinking about on the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment?
I think that we are at a moment where the preservation of our democracy not only requires voting, but to also think about every person who is marginalized, not only from the vote, but from the ability to provide for themselves and their families because of their race, because of their gender expression, their class status, their disabilities. I think that the exciting energy of this moment in retelling these stories in sharper focus and with more depth allows us to understand and be more patient with ourselves as we try to fight the great battles of injustice in our day. And so I hope everyone keeps on learning not only women's history, but also about the history of communities that have been in struggle and communities that have learned that when we fight, we win.
Powerful words. Thank you for that crucially important injunction. We must keep on learning. And that's exactly what all three of you have helped us do so well tonight. So I want to express the most sincere thanks to Elena Popchak, Marcia Chatland, and Gail Harriet for being part of this memorable celebration. Thank you to the amazing Patrice Michaels for having inspired us by setting these sacred texts to such inspiring music, to the gloriously talented Janae Bridges and Laura Ward for bringing the music to life unforgettably, and to all of you friends for taking the time on a summer evening to educate yourself about the Constitution. The learning at the Constitution Center will always continue, and we look forward to continuing to learn with you. Hope to see you on Constitution Day, September 17th, for the Liberty Medal to Justice Ginsburg, if not before. There are lots of great programs coming up. Join me in celebrating the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. And thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful night. Thanks to our panelists. Bye.